Thing going. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Welcome to a very special live DragonCon installment of Audible Interlude, a G.I. Joe podcast. I'm your host, Dave West, codename Phantom Troublemaker.
And I'm your co-host, Noel Wood, codename Crapshoot.
And I'm your Cobra intern who turned to a life of crime because he did not get hired as Bogo the Dancing Bear, codename Legion Cub.
And of course, we have some very special guests with us today, some luminaries from the great history of G.I. Joe comic books. I'm going to let these gentlemen introduce themselves, starting down at the end.
I'm Andrew Lee Griffith. I worked on some of the IDW comics. Towards the end of the IDW run, I also did a couple pages for the 40th anniversary silent interlude. But a lot of the issues I did were like Murder by Assassination, where we introduced characters like Sherlock, and I think Malta was getting introduced during that time.
I'm Larry Hama. I guess I don't have to explain who I am. But it's good to see you all.
So thank you all for coming out this morning. Obviously, this is very exciting. It's a good opportunity to be here as part of the comics and pop art track at DragonCon. This is something that we haven't been able to do before, so this is very special for us. But obviously, everybody in this room, we're going to get the opportunity to ask some questions. We've got a few things. Christian here has put together a little bit of a file on our guests. So we've got some questions, we've got some conversation pieces for the gentleman over here. So take it away. Okay, so who here has heard Audible Interlude before? Got a few out there. So we've got a segment on the show. My father is a retired lieutenant colonel in the Army. And what we've been doing is we do a segment where we'll talk about the file cards that Mr. Hama wrote in the original Real American Hero run. And I've been sending him those file cards because when I was a kid, his engagement with G.I. Joe was a big part of our relationship because my dad's not a big toy guy, but he'd stop on the way home from work every once in a while and bring some new thing that caught his eye home. So that's our relationship was him explaining to me what the Sky Striker was based on, or explaining to me, hey, this Mobat, this is what this tank might have been. But I can't say he ever sat down and read the file cards with me. So he'll give his input on those file cards from a perspective. And one of the things we wanted to ask you about was, when you're writing these, were there ever any instances where maybe there was some military jargon that Hasbro was a little too technical or a little too much? Did you ever have to sort of edit down? What was the feedback process like in writing those file cards?
Well, you have to understand that I originally wrote the file cards just as reference for myself, because I realized that, the first year there were over 10 characters, and geez, at that time that was more than characters in the Avengers had. And I knew from the talk at the office that everybody hated working on the Avengers. Because they go, oh man, there's so many characters, and you gotta look up all those costumes, and it's all reference, It's not like drawing Moon Knight in a blizzard. So I made these what I call dossiers, which are like up to 3 pages long, with listing all their education and training. And then I had like 4 or 5 sections. I had like a general thing explaining who they were. Then I had a peer assessment part that was written in the voice of another G.I. Joe. And then I had a psychological assessment written by a shrink. And one day Kurt Bazikian from Hasbro was visiting the office, and he saw these on my desk. He said, "Oh, we should put these on the back of the packages."
3-page long packages.
But they were so long that, he had, so they were all edited down by Kurt. And he did a really good job of boiling it down to the essentials, but still managing to keep, the flavor. And, most of the jargon, in the comics, I just had characters speaking, with the jargon and put footnotes. Because I thought that was more naturalistic than having the character in exposition, explain, what a Madus was or whatever. That's why one of my favorite artists who worked on the book was Michael Golden, because I didn't have to explain what a Madus was. I didn't have to explain what anything was. He just, I just say, hey, this guy's carrying an M4 or whatever, and he knew what it was. I once saw him draw a quad 50. There was a mount that they invented in World War II to fit on the back of a half-tracker that had 4 M2 Browning 50 caliber machine guns on it. And it was all this tubing and it was really complex piece of machinery. And I watched Michael Golden once draw one of those from memory. And I was like, holy smoke. But then the next day I saw him draw, a World War II model Harley Davidson with a sidecar from memory. And I suspect that the number of cooling fins on the cylinder was correct.
Every last detail.
Yeah, every last detail. It's like nuts and bolts. But anyway, did I wander away from the question? I'm sorry.
No.
No, not at all.
No,
Not at all.
You actually brought up something. As we were going through and reading these file cards, you mentioned putting in the perspective of another G.I. Joe team member or something in there, or a psychological profile. And we were speculating who it was who was actually the one saying that. We were under the idea that maybe it was Hawk for for the original 13 Joes was one that was saying that. But now, as we're into the second and third year, we're seeing some where it's actually attributed to another Joe. So we always appreciate that part of it.
I think most of it, in my head, I was hearing Stalker.
Okay.
Because,
Well, and it's fun to watch them evolve as we've been going. We've just gotten to 1984 and seeing now the references to specific other Joes, because obviously as you're developing these characters and the way that they see each other, it's really interesting, the storytelling aspect of that.
well, that's how, I tried to handle character development that way by, not having the character himself or herself explain who they are, but it's the reactions of the other characters around them. It's like, Snake Eyes is defined by how the other Joes react to him.
I still, from memory, still have some of those in my head when I read those file cards when I was 8 years old, and I can still recite off like what is on some specific person's personal profile there. What was the truth?
That's that original.
So one of the things that Mongoose, that has amused us in Mongoose's notes, especially for the early ones, was their ranks versus some of the descriptions of them. It sounded like some of the people in the Joe team might have caused a lot of trouble before they got onto the Joe team. So was that something that was in the back of your
That's,
mind?
I always tell people that's the way you can tell any G.I. Joe file folder, file card that I didn't write, is that the character is too perfect. Oh, he's the best at blah, 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 and he was first in his class and blah, 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 and, there's no one's better at him than blah, blah, blah. Like, I said, well, no, I mean, people like that I knew in the Army were like hated.
I think we actually had that conversation.
So it's
Julie
like-
is the first one that we encountered that really is more of a, everything is good about him.
Yeah, but it's also, from my time in the service, it was very different. We were constantly told, don't be a hero. Don't John Wayne it. because, you know, the heroes and the John Waynes are the guys that get their buddies killed. And that the intrinsic thing is that you're part of a team. And, you know, heroes are anti-team team. So, but that was one of the major themes of my storylines.
Yeah.
Is that, you know, that it's teamwork, which is why a lot of soldiers and vets feel awkward when people thank them for the service, because it singles them out as individuals, and you know, everything in the military depends on your being able to depend on the next guy. And I thought that was a really important thing to get across. I remember when I was at Benning, I was working at range control, and I had to go into the main post with the first sergeant. I don't know what it was before, but we drove past the infantry school, and there was this big bronze statue of this soldier saying, "Follow me." and the old first shirt looked at that statue, and he looked at me and he said, "Kid, if anybody ever says that to you, don't do it." But I never forgot that.
Well, and that team dynamic was such a big part of the storytelling that carried over into the comic book as well, because it was a military action comic, but really the core of it was how they interacted with each other in the sense of this family or team unit. And I think probably everybody in this room that grew up with it taught us a lot about interacting and working together and recognizing, compensating for other shortcomings and figuring out who's the best at what, and teamwork, the value of teamwork.
Well, I think that's actually the main fantasy that works for G.I. Joe is the camaraderie thing, and you know, loyalty. I mean, because you know, by the time a kid is 9 years old, he's been betrayed. You know, and the idea of, like, you know, being part of a group where nobody betrays you.
Unless you're Cobra.
Is that solid? Well, you know, Cobra has their own system of honor within themselves, but you know, there's a reason why, you know, like veterans feel a bond with other veterans, you know, because I mean, you go through some sphincter puckering lots of people, you can sort of like create some bonds. Anyway, yeah.
So before we get any further, go back to storytelling a little bit. We'll cover it again at the end, but I want to talk about the Kickstarter that's going on right now. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how that's working?
How that works?
Well, for how that's working to your benefit, how this is a piece of your history, your contribution.
Robert Kirkman is fully behind this, and he's a fan, and they're treating me very well on this. I get a piece of the action. I get paid for the stickers and the trading cards and all that stuff. So I can't complain. He's treated me better than any of the other publishers ever had. So
That's great.
That's great to hear.
And not to make anybody feel guilty, how many of you in this room have ordered the compendium? Okay. It's a great set. Yes, so, in case you guys did not know, Mr. Hama does have a new Kickstarter out for what I think is the greatest title of any comic ever. And can you tell us about werewolves versus Mounties.
It's Mounties versus.
Mounties versus werewolves. I'm sorry. Werewolves are more important
Well,
in my
no,
life, but
It's a concept that's been kicking around for a long time in the back of my head. I mean, years ago, in Wolverine, I did an episode where he goes up, he's in Canada, and he has this encounter with the Mounties. And they'll sort of been through his back. This is when he was like feral and wild and, you know.
yeah, the no-nose period.
Yeah. And he, I think it was called the Hunter in Darkness. But I thought, wow, that's a fascinating, you know, because I had to do some research on the Mounties, you know, and that led to like, you know, more reading about the Mounties. So I came up with this idea about 10 years ago, because a friend of mine who's Canadian and advertising guy said, look, Canadian TV is really hungry for material. You know, if you come up with something that's got Canadian content, you know, we can see if we get it produced in Canada. You know, I mean, they subsidize almost everything up there, so it would have to have like what 80% Canadian creators or people working on it, but you know, that was amenable, and so I thought, wow, you know, I imagined this whole thing about you know, a werewolf family coming over from France with the Acadians, you know, people who became, you know, the French Canadians, and later migrated down and became Cajuns in Louisiana. And I thought, well, I think if he was a secretive, you know, sort of clan of werewolves, and they would sort of gravitate towards the northwest, you know, the wilderness and the woods and stuff, where they could sort of blend in and hide out. And then I thought, wow, what if the Mounties had a secret anti-werewolf force?
See what I mean?
Yes.
Every word that has been coming out of his mouth
Is
is
magic.
gold.
If they had a secret anti-werewolf force that, you know, nobody knew about, and their job was to like hold the werewolves back and, you know, keep them from spreading south into populated areas. You know? And then I thought, oh, okay, so I figured that well, there'd be an outpost there. And then for a main character, I thought there were a lot of Mounties that were ex-soldiers in World War I. So I made this be in like in the 1920s, late 20s.
Okay.
And they had this returnee from battlefields of Belgium and France come back to his old job as an officer in the Mounties, and he gets assigned to this place, and he doesn't realize what it is until he gets there. So then I thought, well, I was reading about the Native Canadian schools, these, you know, where they tried to eradicate, you know, Native culture by forcing natives to like send their kids to these boarding schools, where the first thing they did was cut their hair and try to make them into like, you know, upstanding white citizens. You know, I thought, oh, that's something to explore. So I thought, oh, we'll have a native character who's also a veteran of World War I. He's like a sniper. And he comes back, you know, to his home to find out that, you know, all these werewolves are running rampant. So he gets involved. He's not a Mountie, but he's a secondary character. So I tried to come up with 2 or 3 solid native characters. And then, you know, there's the townsfolk.
And how long does the Kickstarter run for, so that the folks here can immediately walk outside and back it?
I think it's halfway through.
Okay.
But, you know, we've got more than half, whatever.
Backers.
Yeah, backers. So we're doing good, but, you know, the last mile is always the hardest.
Yeah.
So yeah,
You
I'd
guys
say
get the
everybody
word
should-
out, it would help.
September 14th. It closes, that's when it closes.
Okay, September 14th.
A couple more weeks.
Okay.
So definitely check
So
it out.
everybody be sure and spread the word about that. And look, to kind of bring it back to G.I. Joe, but also bring it back to horror, towards the end of the IDW run, Andrew, you got involved with that and were able to deal with some interesting stuff there with the Cobra Casino and Serpentor Con, and then the really, like, just how things culminated right at the end of the IDW run. What was your reaction to some of these concepts when you came in and having the opportunity to sort of visualize them?
It was great. I mean, because I grew up with all these characters, and there haven't been, like, as a reader for myself, like, all that many like new characters. Like, and I've even had some fans that come up to me at shows that they weren't happy that we introduced these new characters and stuff. But I'm like, you know, you gotta keep it fresh. Come on. Like, but anyway, they approached me. They're like, would you like to draw a 5-issue story with this new character called Sherlock, which is going to be this like one-armed female. These are my words. I'm nervous. You know, cop character, basically, detective character. And I was like, of course, you know. So for me, it was very exciting. I liked having new characters. I like getting to play in the world I know, but also introducing new ideas. And there were other characters like Malto, and I had some like Filipino fans that were very excited about Malto.
People in the Philippines went crazy.
Yeah, they loved that character. So it was all very exciting for me. I mean, I grew up. This is like one of my first fandoms and like the first comic that I started reading when I really got into comics and stuck with. So it was amazing to me to get to contribute to this book that I loved, you know?
If you guys have not read it, you need to hunt down, I think it's 287, when Serpentor finally breaks out of the tube. Because, you know, they have this thing in comics, right? Like if somebody's birthday suit and you can't show stuff. The placement of Snake Eyes' feet during these battles, I was like, this is skill. This is great. He's not doing the whole, I'm just going to cover everything in shadow.
There's a whole
It's
issue where
like,
this guy looks like a naked Rasputin running around having
Yes.
action scenes, completely buff. And like, you have to choose interesting angles and shadows, and yeah, it was.
and we are all huge fans of Serpentor Con. That when he exploded the bomb, yeah, awesome.
And that's what's, it really made Mounties versus Werewolves make so much sense, because in following along with the new Skybound Real American Hero, the horror elements that you've introduced are just, first of all, to me, G.I. Joe is, yes, military action, but the fantasy element has always been critical to me, because otherwise it's just another military action comic. But once you throw in that fantastical stuff, like the Island of Zombies, and like the cyborg bats, and the, like, that to me is necessary for G.I. Joe. As you're plowing along through these plots and figuring out like what's going to happen this issue, is there a line in that fantastical world that you think you wouldn't cross? Is there anything that's a bridge too far? Or are you willing to just go for it?
Well, I learned a long time ago that you know, there's no such thing as a bad concept or a character. There's bad takes on a concept or character. This is what Neil Adams instilled in me back in the 70s. He proved it, you know, by taking two characters that were usually in the backs of DC Comics, you know, like 5-page stories, and making them A-list characters. I mean, nobody cared about Green Arrow.
True. Right.
Or, and Green Lantern was even, you know, fading into the, you know, into the background at that point, and he put them into the forefront, made them A-list characters. You know, Daredevil was almost moribund when Frank Miller took it over and completely, you know, revitalized it. You know, and there's, you know, even a character like Dazzler, you know, if somebody really wants to do it, they can, you know, bring it up from the doldrums. So I don't think it's a problem.
That's what
Anything is on the table.
Yes.
you gave us zombies in Easy Go scooters, which was something I did not know that I needed in my life, but I kept looking for them in the background art of these issues. Because we're like, these were just regular old people at the casino, and now, yeah, they're mutant freaks.
I mean, when I first saw the concept art for, what's his name? I just blanked out on his name. The guy with his hypno wheel.
No, Crystal Ball.
Crystal Ball. And I thought, what the heck? You know, but then I started thinking about it. Said, well, you know, what if he has this like storefront psychic, you know, storefront in some rundown, seedy strip mall in Jersey. You know? All of a sudden, his character started to make sense. You know? So that goes back to what I was saying before about, you know, you could take any character.
He's like the Saul Goodman of Cobra.
You managed to make Raptor an engaging character for that arc that he had with Cobra Commander. So that was like I had no interest in that figure as a kid until I read your comics. It was like, okay, now I love this.
Now I
character.
need a rep.
I was gonna say, even like the issues we did with October Guard and stuff, it's like there were some body horror elements to that too.
Well, and you mentioned that G.I. Joe was one of the comics that you grew up reading. So can you tell us a little bit about your personal history with Joe?
Sure. I mean, I just remember walking into an department store as a kid and seeing all the JoJo stuff on the rack, and that was my first introduction to it. And like for my one birthday, I got Snake Eyes and Mobat and the MMS missiles or something, and I was just hooked from there. And my older brother had been getting into the comics, and I think the first one I got was like 24, 25 when they were taking Storm Shadow to Alcatraz, and that era. And then I went back and got the earlier issues and read my brother's issues. But I pretty much collected that series ever since. And around the same time, I was getting into like Transformers and stuff. So I don't know if Larry would remember this, but the first time I met him was a small convention in Pennsylvania, and I was sitting between, like one side next to me was Larry Hama, the other side was Bob Beniansky, the Transformers equivalent of Larry Hama. So all day long I got to listen to both their stories, and it was just, as someone who grew up on both of those things, it was just amazing. But yeah, that's kind of my era where I came from.
Well, see, one thing that a lot of readers and fans don't understand is that, you know, all comic book publishing has always been based on the fact that it has a high per issue reader ratio. You know, if you sell one comic book, you might get 20 sets of eyes on it, you know, because it goes into a household with like 5 siblings, you know, all the other kids read it, you know, comics get passed around, you know, well, they used to be.
Yeah.
They started getting sealed into bags. So that's what made all publishing advertising rates are based on those numbers, are based on the estimated eyes on the page. You know, that's why Reader's Digest had the highest advertising rate over Playboy, over Esquire, because Reader's Digest was sitting in the waiting rooms of every doctor and dentist in the country. That and Arizona highways for some reason. And National Geographic. These were
Literature.
yeah, all these magazines that that multiple people read. Like magazines like, Vogue or any of those, very low pass-along ratio. But comic books that are really high pass-along ratio.
I remember going over to my older cousins and reading the very first G.I. Joe issues and Micronauts and speaking of Michael Gold and all the stuff he worked on. I remember seeing my cousin stuff too.
Yeah, I heard from a lot of women that, they had older siblings who were, guys, and, they bought the comics, so they read them. And that's and I don't know how many women have told me that, they read the G.I. Joe comics and they realized, oh, the women in them are treated much differently than the women in superhero comics who are always standing around with their palms. Their foreheads, or they're taking showers in the X-Mansion.
Lots of volleyball there.
Yeah, lots of volleyball in those scanty shorts.
Right.
Rogue was always in his boots and stuff.
Yeah, and they said, in G.I. Joe, the difference was that they were treated equally, and they had equal responsibilities, and they went through the same stuff, and they were respected within the group. So,
Well, and along those lines, and we're talking about characters and everything, I think if we pose this question to you, I think a lot of people have a lot of good ideas. So I do want to actually direct it to Andrew as well, just because you've been on G.I. Joe more recently. Are there any characters that you just really enjoy working with when you're working on these books? Anybody in particular that you'd like to have an opportunity to work with
I
more?
love a preening Cobra Commander when he's in his behind the monitors, and there's always a Tech Viper, and there's always a Tel Viper. In Larry's scripts, there's always certain characters he seems to like to have show up and psych out, in the G.I. Joe side. I don't know. I like those recurring kind of they're not the most popular characters, but they're ones that are always there. You know they're going to be in the little surveillance room or whatever and stuff.
well, I call those exposition characters. There's characters you need to be there to explain stuff. I mean, the only reason the Baroness existed was that in the first batch, none of the Cobras had faces. They were completely. And it's very hard to have dramaturgy or drama with no agents of expression. It's like having lumps talking to you. So, and I realized this when I was writing the first issue. I said, this is really going to be hard. So I talked to Herb Trimpe and I said, look, we got to make up a female character. A character with no mask, so that this character can interact with Cobra Commander and react. So while we're at it, let's make it a female character, and while we're at it, let's put her in a tight black leather outfit with high heels. And Herb went to town on it. And,
One of the most popular characters of all time.
yeah. But the thing is, none of the toy companies wanted to do female action figures because they were afraid that a 10-year-old boy would see a female action figure as a doll. And no 10-year-old boy is going to be caught dead buying a doll. But this was common,
Yeah.
sort of knowledge at the time, but that got disproven. I think they made the Baroness a mail away. And, he sold so many of them that they realized, hey, if we do this right, you know, we could sell a lot of these action figures. So they started adding female action figures after that. They were really reluctant to do Scarlet even at first.
That is so.
I'm curious about that.
Yeah.
Because when you think of Scarlet, Baroness, CoverGirl, to your point, like none of these are ever like, oh, the damsel in distress. Like Baroness is just as deadly, if not more, you know, sneaky and underhanded than any of the guys running Cobra. And I want that toy.
Even like some of the minor characters that you developed that we never got to. We talked about Bongo the Balloon Bearer. Like you made Candy Apple like a strong character in her arc.
Well, you know, a lot of the characters that I created to like fill those gaps in storytelling, I never expected them to make them into figures. Like, you know, like the October Guard, you know, Quinn Diesco. They even made Billy into a figure.
Yeah.
You know, to like, wow. So that is sort of gratifying to see them, you know, actually become, you know, action figures. Even Shooter.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That was a, you know, a lettering error. Not an error, but you know, the letterer Rick Parker just, you know, there was an extra blank space, you know, and just wrote in Shooter because he was like, you know, toadying up to the editor. And so I kept, over the years, people kept saying, well, who's Shooter? Who's Shooter? So I finally said, okay. So I created this character as based on a girl I went to high school with, who I'm still in contact with. She has like 5 sons who are all in the military.
Oh, wow.
So, and I sent her a full box of the figures.
I love Shooter in the sense that we thought we knew everything about the original Joe team, and then here we are, decades later. Now we're uncovering more, and I think that's great that we can go back and we can like pull things that might have even started as an error or just tribute like that. And now we've got new characters and new storylines built out of it.
Well, Jodie Craig is a real person.
Okay.
So you guys asked me some of the favorite characters to work on. One of the favorite things I did was narrate a story while I was working on those books. I went back and added more to the Storm Shadow and Snake Eyes origin story in Vietnam and everything. And that was an amazing story for me to do because I always love those background stories when you dove into their history and everything. So that was a really cool issue to work on. And speaking of which, when you mentioned how Stalker was your point of view for like the file cards, a lot of those stories, he's often like the point of view character relating the stories. So that was interesting that you said that.
Well, he's the main character who runs through that all those Vietnam stories, and I figure he's, you know, the best choice to narrate that stuff.
It's one of the things that we noticed in rereading the earlier issues, when we talk about them on the podcast, is Stalker's the leader of the team in those issues.
Yeah.
You don't think of anybody else. So like much later on, when Duke is introduced, you're kind of like,
Here's this guy that got a
This
figure.
is-
We're gonna give him a couple of issues, and then we're gonna move back.
you got the cartoon, Duke. Let's just leave you there because things have been running fine.
To go back to talking about the female characters and the agency that they have, and how critical they were to the plots and the storytelling. Obviously, with the time we're working at Marvel, social consciousness in comic books has always been a thing, is a critical component, I think, of the comics industry. Being in that Marvel environment, was it inspiring to be around people who were looking to teach through storytelling in that way?
Well, sure. I mean, you know, when people say, oh, you know, they're making the X-Men woke. I mean, wait a second. The whole reason they exist, you know, was was a commentary on prejudice and all that. I mean, that's not like, you know, retconning. It's all there. If people couldn't see that, it makes you wonder, you know, like how, you know, what kind of blinders they're wearing. I mean, Superman was always about social justice. I mean, you know, Superman was created by, you know, two sons of Jewish immigrants. I mean, and it's really about it's really about immigrant experience. I mean, he's from another planet.
It doesn't get more immigrant than that.
You don't get more immigrant than that, right? You know, it's odd how people can actually retcon themselves.
Well, you have had an interesting way of describing your writing style as retconning, because you issue to issue, and again, that's something that we love, because you're like, this is how this issue ends. We have no idea what Larry is going to do next, and it keeps that excitement.
Yeah,
and,
as well as page by page. I mean, I have no idea how many of the stories end myself until I get there, and this is because I read so many things and see so many things in movies and TV where, you know, after the first 5 minutes I know where it's going or how it's going to end, or, you know, that the butler did it. But I figure if I don't know, I can't telegraph it. You know? It's also, I always try to let the characters write the stories rather than, you know, a lot of writers, they write a plot, and then they take the characters and they march the characters through the plot. To me, that's not a story, that's choreography. It's like, I know sometimes I get to a point in the story where, you know, I sort of in my head had plotted out that this character was going to do such and such, and then I realized, no, he wouldn't do that. You know, it's because since I base all the characters on people I know or people whose traits I know, like, you know, like a famous actor or something, you know, then that was my way of keeping the characters consistent. So if it gets to a point where, in the story, where the character has to act out of character in order to make the plot work, I change the plot rather than change the character. And sometimes it makes the story like go, you know, askew a little, but I think that's better than just having the characters fulfill the service of the plot. I think the plot serves the characters, not the opposite. The plot is just a basic framework to hang really good characters on.
Okay.
Because,
So-
look, I've asked people 1,000 times, like, have you seen all the Harry Potter movies? Yeah. Well, tell me what happened. And he said, go. You know, I said, you don't remember the plot, but you know everything about all those characters. I said the same thing about Peanuts. You know, you've read Peanuts all your life, but not a single one of you can tell me what happens in any one given Sunday Peanuts strip. You can't. Everybody says, oh, I can do that. You know, Charlie Brown is like, Lucy is holding the football, and Charlie Brown is kind of run over, and at the last minute, Lucy pulls it. I said, that's just a setup. That's the universal setup for that. He's done it 1,000 times. What? Tell me one punchline, and no one can do it. And I said, yeah, but at the same time, if I asked you to write a 2-page psychological analysis of Schroeder, because you know those Peanut characters, because you learn about them in the same way that you learn about real people, in tiny increments every day over a long period of time. Nobody explained Lucy to you in one day. You learned about her by little snippets of seeing her in action. And, I try to apply that to G.I. Joe. So that, G.I. Joe has always been character-centric rather than plot-centric. So I can't remember the plots.
Well, now we're gonna let our audience remind you of some of those awesome plots, because we got a few minutes left, so it's Q&A time. So we'll go with you, and then we'll go back there, so.
I love the fact that your writing process got brought back up, because it's one of the things that I always like to think about and highlight when having discussions about G.I. Joe and how you've written it. Has there ever been a moment being that it's kind of a stream of conscious, intuitive narrative, the way you write, not knowing the ending before you start, that you've gotten like 2 or 3 issues down the road and you're like, crap, I wish I'd taken a left when I took a right. Like 3 issues ago, where you're telling a story and like all right, I don't have to work around that.
Well, no, because as erratic and as my system seems, I'm also sort of on the spectrum. I just get bugged by, anything being out of place. So I try to nail it first time. I've never regretted anything that I've ever written like that. No.
Thank you.
And lady in the back.
So the action figure thing. What I did was I took my brother's G.I. Joe figures and my Barbies, and my mom sewed, so we take scraps of fabric and make them outfits. And they would go on missions together, and it looked like they had a band of well-dressed Amazons. The part that always pissed me off was that their stupid little hands would never hold the weapons, and they were never to scale, so everything looked like a derringer. And they wouldn't fit in the vehicle, so they would ride on the hood or hang on the But then I figured out that you could fit a whole lot of G.I. Joe figures into the Barbie Corvette, so they started taking her car to a mission. And I had one Princess Leia figure that got to go too, and they just didn't talk about the size difference, it was a thing. And every time I would go to a bar, like we would go to a bar or restaurant, I would be like, do they have the little swords? Because those into the Barbie can.
Oh, those plastic toothpicks? I remember those.
I had so many of those, and my friends who had braces, I'd be like, can I have the little rubber bands? Because it's the only way they can hold the weapon. So that's what we did. It was a whole thing, and the neighborhood kids would kind of play Barbies with me, usually once. But my brother played with me a lot, and it was a thing. So we figured it out, but it would have been a whole lot easier, and so I'm really happy now that the figures are actually available, so.
Thank you for sharing that.
All right, so we're gonna go to this gentleman, then you.
One thing that made me say, yes, I must start reading this comic when I was a kid was seeing those advertisements. It's like the only comic book that I can think of that they actually had ads for. And I was just wondering what the story was behind it and what was your involvement in that happening.
Well, there was this genius at Hasbro named Bob Prupris who figured out, well, see, at that time, you couldn't do animated toy commercials. You were limited to something like 4.5 seconds of animation per commercial, and it had to actually show the actual limitations of the toy. Okay, because they didn't want people, fooling kids. And Bob realized if it's a comic book, that's a publication. and that's covered under the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. So you could do an advertisement for a comic book that was fully animated and really violent. And it was legal, it was okay. But you had to have a comic book. And if that comic book, you know, by chance happened to have all the toys in it that you wanted to advertise, you know, that was okay. So they put together 4 commercials for the first year, and I had to draw the covers. You know, I did the designs for the covers for all 4 issues because, you know, they needed the cover to spin out and stop. So I did the covers way before I wrote the issues. So I had to make those issues fit those covers. Even if they had, like, you know, a snowmobile and a hang glider in the same image. You know, oh, how do I craft a story that's got both a snowmobile and a hang glider in it?
Just kind of like what he was asking.
Yeah, so, you know, that's the story of that. And, you know, the commercials really worked. I could never understand why the comic book industry didn't jump on that as soon as they realized what the numbers were generating. You know. But they were just behind the times and too cheap. It was like the same way that the comic book industry gave up on girls in the 60s. Prior to that, more than half of comic books printed in the United States were consumed by girls. There were whole lines of comics just for girls. There were romance comics, there were like Night Nurse and stuff like that. There were Harvey comics, Little Archie comics, Walt Disney comics, all this stuff. When I was a kid, all my girl cousins and all the girls that I knew had stacks of comics, but they were like girl comics. But if I was over at their house, I would read them. You know, I became a very big fan of Little Lulu and stuff like that. One of the best storytellers ever was Marge, who did Little Lulu. And you know, and even like superhero stalwarts like Jack Kirby and Johnny Romita, the bulk of their early work was romance comics. There's thousands of pages extant of their stuff. John Buscema also. So, and I spent 20 years at Marvel trying to convince them to like do comics for girls. And they said, "Oh, we tried that, and nobody bought them." I said, "Well, nobody bought them because they sucked." I said, if you did, really good comics for girls, they'd buy them, because,
Oh,
Anyway, that's.
so gentleman right there, and then we'll get you.
In the early days of GeoJet, had you ever considered doing like a day one origin of Code?
Can I speak up?
In the early days of GeoJet, had you ever considered doing like a day one origin of Code Commander storyline, like how he got the whole thing going? Because I know we kind of, in the comics, you were always like the whole organization was already there. Like,
Well, I tried to avoid that because that always annoyed me when I read it in books or movies. They would spend, 3/4 of the movie, explaining how something came to be.
okay.
And I didn't care. It's like, I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in what they're doing now.
One more quick one.
Okay. How do you feel about all the different shipping relationships throughout both G.I. Joe and Cobra? Although really for Cobra, I can only think of one, that being Baroness and Deathstroke. But do you have any kind of, when you were writing those stories or anything that dealing with any relationship with anybody, do you have any, why you wrote those into the adventures?
Well,
Throughout?
again, it's the characters writing themselves, basically, and, I just give them their lead, let them do it, and rather than try to force characters into situations. If I see a natural development, then I go with it.
Do you have a favorite?
Favorite what?
Relationship in the, for G.I. Joe or Cobra, relationship. Do you have a favorite one in particular that you do like a little more than the others?
To me, the core characters are Snake Eyes, Scarlet, Storm Shadow, and Stalker. And everything, all the stories sort of, originate with them. So, and I haven't altered their relationship all that much. It just grows. So.
All right, and for our videographer, one super quick question.
Well, first and foremost, thank you for what you do for helping create G.I. Joe. And me personally, I'm a U.S. soldier with the Virginia Army National Guard for 9 years. And one of the reasons I joined the military, I will admit, Full Metal Jacket is one of them, but definitely G.I. Joe was a big influence. And I want to say thank you for that. So, and that being said, I have a question is, how was the influence of many soldiers or naval men like myself was so influenced by your comics and the toys and stuff for G.I. Joe?
I'm sorry, you gotta speak up a little.
Well, I'm sorry, voice is low. Basically, were you surprised of the influence of why a lot of people joined the military because of G.I. Joe?
Well, yeah, that wasn't my purpose. In fact, in the last Marvel issue, I tried to explain, maybe why you shouldn't join. But I left it in the air. I said, look, you're not going to get a parade. These are all things that are not going to happen. You're not going to get really good health coverage. I've had bad experiences with the VA myself. But there are these factors of the thing that you will never have friends and comrades in civilian life like you had in the military, and that the value system is vastly different. That in Ivy League colleges, they do not teach the main precept in the military that you are if you have any rank at all, you're personally responsible for everybody that reports to you. This is a given. They don't teach that at Harvard or Yale in business school. Because if you're responsible for everybody that reports to you, you don't eat, you don't sleep until they do. And that's ironclad. It's built into the system, and it's sorely missing from civilian life.
Amen.
Larry and Andrew, thank you both very much for hanging out with us today. This has been a fantastic time. Where can we find you both online, and what have you got going on right now?
What have I got going on? Well, right now I'm writing number 314. And I'm working on Montes and Werewolves. I've got 3 150-page graphic novels coming out from Abrams based on Japanese fairy tales called The Fox Princess.
Okay.
And I've got 2 other graphic novels that I've been working on in the works. I've got various projects. I'm a busy boy.
And Andrew, what do you got going on? Where can we find you online?
Well, you can find me here at the show in the Artist Alley at table 437. Yeah, 437. my main thing right now is a creator-owned book called Sigma, which is like a sci-fi thing I'm doing with John Barber, who is the editor-in-chief at IDW. Him and I are working on that. And then I've been doing like Magic the Gathering art, stuff like that. So that's been keeping me busy lately. And then you can find me online, pretty much any social network as Glove Studios. So that's really fun.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming out. This has been fantastic. If you are in a costume, if you could join us right over here, we want to get a group picture with our guests. But thank you all for coming out. Check out Audible Interlude, G.I. Joe Podcast, and have a great DragonCon.